The Christmas lights were warm and soft, but the room felt cold the moment my father cleared his throat. The table was set like a magazine spread, golden turkey, crystal glasses, a fake pine centerpiece dusted with artificial snow. My mother sat straight-backed, lips tight, eyes darting between my father and me as if she were watching a verdict being prepared. I had flown in late that afternoon, tired but hopeful. Christmas used to mean laughter in this house. I hadn't realized how long ago that version of us had died. My father didn't bother with small talk. He set his fork down with a deliberate click, the kind he used when he wanted attention. "We need to talk about the villa," he said. I blinked. "What about it?" "The one in the hills," my mother added quickly, her voice smooth but rehearsed. "The one you bought last year." I knew what was coming before the words landed. The $780,000 villa had been the result of years of grinding work, sleep-deprived nights, failed startups, one near bankruptcy that taught me humility the hard way. I had bought it quietly, not to show off, but to finally feel safe. It was mine, fully paid, no loans, no favors. My father leaned back. "We've decided it should be in our name." The word "decided" hit harder than the demand itself. I laughed once, short and disbelieving. "You're joking." My mother reached for her water, hands trembling just enough to notice. "You're not married. You don't have children. What do you need such a big place for? It should stay in the family." "It is in the family," I said. "I'm your son." My father's eyes narrowed. "Don't twist words. You owe us. We raised you, fed you, educated you." There it was. The invisible invoice I'd been paying my whole life. "I've supported you for years," I said carefully. "I send money every month. I paid off your debts. I renovated this house." "That's nothing compared to what we gave you," he snapped. "Sign the papers." After Christmas, silence pressed in on us. The lights hummed. Somewhere outside, children laughed, the sound drifting in through a cracked window like a reminder of another world. "I'm not signing anything," I said, calm, final. The slap came so fast I didn't see it. Just a sharp crack and a burst of white behind my eyes. My chair scraped backward as I stood, heart pounding, cheek burning. My mother gasped, hand flying to her mouth, but she didn't move toward me. She didn't tell him to stop. My father stood too, chest heaving. "Ungrateful," he said, "after everything." I looked at them, really looked. Not the parents I remembered, but two people who saw me as an asset. A vault with legs. Something to control. "I'm leaving," I said, "and don't contact me again." I walked out into the cold night with my face still stinging and my chest hollow. I didn't cry. Not then. Something inside me had gone very still. Revenge didn't come as rage, it came as clarity. For the first month I disappeared. I changed my number, blocked emails, returned unopened letters. I focused on work the way I always had when life tried to break me. I poured myself into a project I'd been considering for a year, a boutique investment fund aimed at distressed properties. Quiet, legal, ruthless in its efficiency. The second month, I did my homework. I pulled records, traced old loans, examined names buried in paperwork my father had once forced me to sign, just in case. I found what he had hidden even from my mother: guarantees, liabilities. His signature on a business venture that had gone bad years ago, patched temporarily by money I had unknowingly provided. I didn't expose him. Not yet. Instead, I withdrew my support. Every transfer stopped. Every safety net vanished. I informed their bank, politely, formally, that I would no longer be backing any accounts tied to my name. I sold a small apartment I'd purchased for them years ago and redirected the proceeds into a trust they couldn't touch. The third month, the consequences bloomed. Calls from unknown numbers, emails marked urgent, a message from my mother's cousin saying she was worried. I ignored them all until one rainy afternoon when my doorbell rang. They looked smaller standing there, soaked and pale. My father's shoulders were slumped. My mother's eyes were red-rimmed, mascara smudged. They hadn't brought anger with them. They had brought fear. "We just want to talk," my mother said, voice breaking. I stepped aside and let them in. They sat on my sofa like guests who had overstayed their welcome in life. My father didn't meet my eyes. "The bank is pressuring us," he said quietly. "The business, it collapsed. We need help." My mother reached for my hand. I pulled it back. "You slapped me?" I said. Not loud, not emotional. Just factual. "On Christmas?" He flinched. "We didn't mean," she began. "I meant my refusal," I said. "And you meant to hurt me." Silence again. Thicker this time. My father finally looked up. "We were desperate." "So was I," I replied. Every time you reminded me I owed you for being born, they begged. Not dramatically. Worse, softly, with excuses and tears and promises. They asked for forgiveness like it was another asset to be transferred. I listened. Then I stood. "I won't take your house," I said. Relief flashed across their faces. "I won't expose your debts. I won't let you drown." They sagged with gratitude. "But you will never control me again," I continued. "You will apologize. Publicly. You will acknowledge that the villa is mine, that you had no right to demand it, and that you crossed a line you can never uncross." My father's jaw tightened. "And," I added, "you will live with what you did." They agreed. They had no choice. I didn't feel victorious when they left. Revenge wasn't sweet. It was clean. It gave me back my spine that night. I stood on the balcony of my villa, lights of the city glittering below like 1,000 quiet witnesses. The house was silent, peaceful. Mine. I realized something then: the greatest revenge wasn't making them beg. It was choosing myself and never asking permission again. The Christmas dinner table looked perfect, almost staged, as if it were meant for a photograph rather than a family gathering. Warm yellow lights reflected off polished cutlery, and the smell of roasted turkey mixed with cinnamon and cloves filled the room. Outside, faint laughter and distant carols floated through the cold air, reminding me that for most people this night meant comfort, belonging, and love. I had arrived carrying those same expectations, tired from travel but quietly hopeful that, for a few hours at least, I could simply be a son again instead of a provider, a fixer, or a walking solution to other people's problems. My parents sat across from me, dressed neatly, smiling just enough to pass as festive, yet something felt off. The smiles didn't reach their eyes. Conversation stayed shallow, whether relatives, how busy the roads were, like they were killing time, waiting for a signal only they could hear. Every time my fork touched the plate, I sensed tension tightening the air, as though the room itself was holding its breath. Then my father set his cutlery down with deliberate precision. The sound was small, but it sliced through the chatter like a blade. My mother straightened her posture, fingers tightening around her glass. In that instant, I understood that Christmas was over, even though dessert hadn't been served. He didn't ease into it. No jokes, no softening words. He spoke with the same tone he used when issuing instructions, not requests. He mentioned the villa, the one I had bought quietly after years of relentless work. The 780,000 home wasn't a trophy to me. It was a symbol of survival. It represented nights spent staring at ceilings, calculating risks, rebuilding after failure, and choosing discipline when shortcuts tempted me. I had paid for it myself, every cent earned the hard way, and for the first time in my life, I felt secure. When my father said it should be transferred into their name, my first reaction was disbelief. I actually thought I had misheard him. My mind searched for context, for a punchline, for any sign that this was a misunderstanding. But his expression was steady, resolved. My mother nodded, already prepared to justify the demand. They didn't ask, they explained. They spoke about family tradition, about how property should stay under parental authority, about how unmarried children had no real need for independence. Each sentence stripped away another layer of warmth from the evening. I realized they weren't proud of what I had built, they felt entitled to it. As they talked, memories surfaced, times I had sent money without being asked why, times I had covered expenses quietly, times I had been praised not for who I was, but for what I could provide. I saw how neatly this moment fit into a pattern I had ignored for years. The villa wasn't the beginning of their entitlement. It was simply the largest prize yet. I tried to explain calmly. I reminded them of the sacrifices I had made, of how this home represented stability I had never known growing up. I told them it was mine, not out of rebellion, but out of self-respect. My words felt reasonable, even gentle, yet they landed like insults. That was when the atmosphere shifted from cold to hostile. My father's face hardened, disappointment turning into anger. My mother's voice sharpened as she reminded me of everything they had done for me, tallying my childhood as if it were a debt ledger. Love became leverage. Parenthood became a contract I had unknowingly signed at birth. In that moment, something inside me cracked, not loudly but deeply. I saw clearly that this dinner was never about celebration. It was a negotiation disguised as tradition, a demand wrapped in tinsel and lights. Christmas had merely been the stage they chose, believing nostalgia would weaken my resolve. When I refused, firmly and without apology, The silence that followed was heavy and dangerous. It was the silence of expectations collapsing. The warmth in the room evaporated completely, leaving only power and control struggling for dominance. That was the true betrayal, not just the demand for my villa, but the realization that my parents were willing to sacrifice my dignity for ownership, my sense of self for their sense of authority. In a single conversation, the meaning of family shifted. The people I had trusted to value me beyond material success revealed that, to them, love came with conditions, and obedience was the price. By the time the argument escalated, Christmas no longer mattered. The lights, the food, the decorations became irrelevant props in a scene where the truth finally stood exposed. That dinner didn't just ruin a holiday, it marked the moment I understood who I was to them and who I would have to become for myself. The moment my refusal left my mouth, the air seemed to snap like a wire pulled too tight. I remember my heartbeat thudding in my ears, loud enough to drown out the soft Christmas music still playing somewhere in the background. For a second, no one spoke. My father stared at me as if I had violated some unspoken law, his eyes dark with disbelief. I had said no before in small ways, postponed payments, questioned decisions, but never like this. Never directly. Never without apology. His chair scraped back sharply as he stood, the legs screeching against the floor. I could feel my mother's gaze flicking between us, her lips parting as if she wanted to intervene, but no words came. She didn't stand. She didn't reach for him. She stayed seated, frozen, and in that stillness I understood that whatever happened next, I was on my own. "You think you can talk to me like that?" My father said, his voice low and trembling with anger. His hands were clenched, knuckles pale. "After everything we've done for you." I opened my mouth to answer, but I never got the chance. The slap landed with a sharp, cracking sound that echoed through the room. For a split second, I didn't even register pain, just shock. The world tilted, my vision flashing white as my head snapped to the side. A burning sensation spread across my cheek, followed by a deep, humiliating heat that crawled down my neck and into my chest. I tasted metal. My body reacted before my mind could catch up, my chair sliding back as I stood abruptly, palms pressing into the table to steady myself. Time slowed in a strange, distorted way. I was aware of everything at once: the clatter of a fork hitting the floor, the faint smell of gravy, the soft glow of lights that suddenly felt obscene in their cheerfulness. I could hear my own breathing, fast and uneven, like I had been running. My mother gasped, a hand flying to her mouth, but she still didn't move toward me. She didn't say my name. That hurt almost as much as the slap itself. My father's chest rose and fell violently. He looked almost surprised by what he had done, but the anger in his eyes quickly swallowed any trace of regret. "Ungrateful," he spat. "I didn't raise you to defy me." That word defy cut deep, as if protecting something I had earned was an act of rebellion rather than self-respect, as if my adulthood was an inconvenience to his authority. I touched my cheek slowly, feeling the heat, the sting, the reality of it. The physical pain was sharp, but the emotional weight was heavier. Something sacred had been broken. Not because he hit me, but because in that moment, I realized he felt entitled to do so. He believed he still owned me. I looked at my mother, searching her face for something: remorse, anger on my behalf, any sign that she saw how wrong this was. Her eyes were wet, but she remained silent. That silence screamed louder than words. It told me she would choose peace with him over justice for me. It told me that, to her, this was unfortunate but acceptable. A strange calm settled over me then, cold and steady. The kind of calm that comes when a final illusion collapses. I didn't shout. I didn't threaten. I didn't raise my hand back, even though every instinct urged me to. I realized that if I did, I would still be playing by his rules, trapped in the same cycle of dominance and submission. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. My father scoffed. "Good. Maybe you'll come to your senses?" I picked up my coat slowly, deliberately, as if each movement was a declaration of independence. My hands shook, but I didn't let them see it. I glanced once more around the room, the half-eaten meal, the decorations, the life that was supposed to represent home. It all felt foreign, like I was standing in someone else's story. At the door I paused, not because I wanted to stay, but because I wanted them to hear me clearly. "Don't contact me again," I said. "Not until you understand what you just did." My father said nothing. My mother whispered my name, but it was too late. Outside, the cold air hit my burning face, sharp and cleansing. I stood there for a moment, staring up at the dark sky, feeling the sting on my cheek and something heavier settling in my chest. I didn't cry. The tears stayed locked behind a wall of resolve. I knew, with unsettling certainty, that this slap had changed everything. It wasn't just an act of violence. It was a line drawn in bloodless ink, separating the person I had been from the one I was about to become. As I walked away, I understood one thing with absolute clarity. Love that demands obedience is not love at all. And from that realization, something far more dangerous than anger was born: unshakable resolve. Walking away from my parents' house that night didn't feel dramatic. There was no storm, no shouting from behind me, no last-minute apology that made me hesitate at the gate. It was quiet, almost disturbingly so. The kind of quiet that settles after something irreversible has happened. My cheek still burned from the slap, but the deeper ache sat somewhere behind my ribs, heavy and unfamiliar. I didn't know it then, but that silence would become my strongest weapon. The first thing I did was disappear, not in a theatrical way, not to punish them outright, but to protect myself. I changed my number within days. I stopped checking emails I knew would be from family. I asked my assistant to filter calls and reject anything that carried familiar names. It wasn't fueled by anger as much as clarity. For the first time, I understood that any response, even an argument, would keep me tethered to the same power dynamic. Silence, on the other hand, took that power away. At first, the quiet was unsettling. My life had always been noisy with responsibility, messages asking for help, reminders of obligations, subtle guilt wrapped in casual conversation. Now there was space, too much space. I filled it the only way I knew how, with work. Long hours didn't feel like a burden anymore, they felt like control. Every decision I made was mine alone, unfiltered by expectation or approval. I stopped the monthly transfers without announcement, no warnings, no explanations. I simply ended them. The money I had been sending for years wasn't charity. It had become an assumption. Removing it wasn't revenge, it was reality asserting itself. I redirected my focus to securing what I had built. I reviewed contracts I had signed too casually in the past, documents where trust had replaced caution. I began untangling myself from arrangements that tied my success to their comfort. As the weeks passed, I felt something unexpected: relief. Not happiness, not yet, but relief. Mornings were quieter. Decisions were cleaner. I no longer felt that constant low, great anxiety of being needed for reasons that had nothing to do with love. The villa became more than a house, it became a refuge. I spent evenings there in silence, standing on the balcony, watching the city lights flicker like distant stars. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for someone to call with a problem only I could fix. In the second month, I stopped reacting emotionally to the past. Instead, I examined it. I pulled old files, bank statements, emails. I didn't do this out of suspicion at first, but out of necessity. I wanted to know exactly where I stood. What I found surprised me, not because it was shocking, but because it was revealing. I had been more deeply involved in my parents' financial stability than I had realized. Guarantees I barely remembered signing. Accounts linked quietly under the justification of just in case. I saw how my support hadn't just helped them, it had shielded them from the consequences of their own choices. I didn't confront them. I didn't threaten exposure. I simply removed myself from the equation. I separated my name from shared risks, restructured assets, and made sure that what was mine could no longer be touched by anyone else's expectations. Each step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I had loaned out without realizing it. By the third month, the silence had done its work. Messages began to find their way through mutual contacts. First, concern disguised as curiosity, then urgency, then desperation. I heard through distant relatives that things were tight, that stress had taken over the house I once called home. I felt no satisfaction in that knowledge, only confirmation. Confirmation that boundaries mattered. Confirmation that my presence had been holding more together than anyone had admitted. What surprised me most was how calm I felt. The urge to explain myself never returned. I didn't rehearse speeches in my head. I didn't fantasize about confrontations. I understood that my silence wasn't avoidance. It was a statement. It said I would no longer negotiate my worth. It said access to me was no longer unconditional. That period of disappearance changed me more than the slap ever could. I learned that walking away didn't make me weak. It made me precise. I learned that not answering was sometimes louder than shouting. Most of all, I learned that peace isn't something you beg for from people who hurt you. It's something you build by stepping out of their reach. By the time 3 months had passed, I was no longer the person who had left that Christmas dinner with a burning cheek and a shattered illusion. I had become someone quieter, steadier, and far more dangerous to anyone who mistook kindness for submission. Silence hadn't erased the pain, but it had refined it into resolve, and that resolve would shape everything that came next. By the time the 3rd month began, my emotions had cooled enough for logic to take the wheel completely. Anger is loud and reckless. It wants immediate release. What I felt now was different, focused, disciplined, almost surgical. I wasn't interested in shouting truths or exposing secrets out of spite. I wanted balance restored, and the only way to do that was to let reality surface on its own, without me acting like the villain they could point to. I started with structure. For years, my financial life had been built on trust, handshakes disguised as family loyalty, signatures given without scrutiny, assumptions that blood guaranteed fairness. I corrected that mistake quietly. I sat with my lawyers and accountants not to attack anyone, but to protect myself fully and finally. We went through every document I had ever signed that involved my parents, line by line, clause by clause. What emerged was a map of invisible threads that had tied my stability to theirs. There were guarantees attached to old business ventures my father had launched and quietly abandoned. There were accounts that bore my name as a silent backstop, giving lenders confidence without my day-to-day involvement. There were even properties where my financial presence had kept interest rates low, risk minimized, consequences delayed. None of it had been illegal. All of it had been convenient for them. I didn't pull the plug recklessly. That would have caused noise, suspicion, and blame. Instead, I withdrew with precision. Guarantees were legally ended at the earliest allowable dates. Accounts were restructured so my name no longer served as collateral. I informed banks formally that I would not be renewing any support agreements, using language so neutral it was impossible to challenge. There was no accusation, no explanation, just a clear boundary stated in ink. At the same time, I secured my own assets like never before. The villa was placed into a structure that made ownership unquestionable and untouchable. I consolidated investments, closed loopholes, and ensured that nothing I owned could be leveraged emotionally or financially by anyone else. Each move was documented, transparent, and irreversible. I wasn't hiding, I was fortifying. What followed wasn't chaos, but exposure. Without my silent backing, cracks that had been patched for years began to widen. Banks asked questions they had previously ignored. Deadlines that had been flexible suddenly became fixed. Decisions postponed indefinitely were now demanding resolution. I wasn't causing the collapse, I was simply no longer preventing it. I heard fragments of the aftermath through distant channels. Stress had crept into my parents' lives like an unwelcome guest that refused to leave. My father's confidence, once unshakable, reportedly turned brittle. My mother, who had always relied on my quiet interventions, found herself facing uncertainty without a buffer. The safety net they had mistaken for entitlement was gone, and the fall, though not immediate, was inevitable. Yet through all of this, I remained invisible. I didn't gloat. I didn't send messages that said, "I warned you." I didn't show up to watch the consequences unfold. That was the hardest part, but also the most powerful. By staying absent, I denied them a target for their anger. They couldn't blame my cruelty because there was none on display. All they could confront were their own choices. In that period, I understood something profound. True leverage doesn't come from threats, it comes from independence. The moment I removed myself from the system that depended on me, the system had to reveal its flaws. I didn't need to punish them directly. Their own decisions did that far more effectively than I ever could. There were nights when doubt crept in, quiet questions about whether I was being too harsh, whether family deserved more leniency. But each time I remembered the slap, the demand, the certainty with which they believed they could take what was mine. I remembered that boundaries aren't cruelty, they're clarity. And clarity, once established, is non-negotiable. By the end of that month, the outcome was sealed. The trap they had built from entitlement and assumption had finally closed, not because I forced it shut, but because I stepped out of it. My revenge wasn't loud, emotional, or destructive. It was clean. It was legal. and most importantly, it left me standing untouched, watching from a distance as reality reclaimed its due. The knock on my door came on a gray afternoon, the kind where the sky feels heavy and the air carries a quiet warning. I knew who it was before I even looked through the peephole. Some instincts sharpen when you've been forced to grow up early, and mine told me this moment had been moving toward me for weeks. Still, when I opened the door and saw my parents standing there, something twisted low in my stomach. Not pain, not anger, but recognition. This was the sound of consequences finally arriving. They looked older than I remembered. Not dramatically so, but enough to notice. My father's shoulders sagged, his posture no longer rigid with authority. The lines on his face seemed deeper, etched by stress rather than time. My mother clutched her handbag like a lifeline, her eyes red, rimmed, and tired. They weren't dressed for a celebration or an argument. They were dressed for survival. For a moment, none of us spoke. The silence between us was thick, filled with things we had all avoided saying for months. I stepped aside without a word and let them in. Not out of forgiveness, but out of control. This was my space now, and they were visitors in it. They sat on the couch, close together, as if proximity might protect them. I remained standing. It wasn't intentional at first, but once I realized it, I didn't correct it. Some dynamics don't need to be announced. They make themselves visible. My father was the first to speak. His voice was lower than I remembered, stripped of its old certainty. He didn't demand. He didn't accuse. He explained. The business had collapsed. The bank had stopped delaying. The pressure was relentless, and options were gone. As he spoke, his words tumbled out faster, desperation bleeding through every carefully chosen phrase. My mother joined in softly, tears welling as she talked about sleepless nights, about fear, about how everything felt like it was slipping away. She reached for my hand again, just like she had so many times when I was younger, when comfort flowed only in one direction. This time, I didn't pull away. I didn't hold on either. I simply let her touch my fingers, neutral and still. Then came the begging. It wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, no collapsing to the floor. It was worse than that, quiet, broken, heavy with shame. They asked for help the way people do when pride has already been burned away. They promised things they should have promised years ago. Respect. Boundaries. Change. As I listened, I felt something unexpected: distance. Not coldness, but clarity. I could see them as they were, not as the figures of authority they once held over me. For the first time, they were just people, flawed, frightened, and facing the results of choices they had never thought they'd have to own. When they finished, the room fell silent again. I sat down across from them, finally bringing us to the same level, but not the same ground. "I'm not taking your house," I said calmly. Relief flickered across their faces. "I'm not exposing your debts. I'm not interested in ruining you." They exhaled, hope rising too quickly. "But," I continued, "I'm also not giving you control over my life ever again." The relief froze. I told them exactly what would happen. I would help stabilize the situation, not because they demanded it, not because they were my parents, but because I chose to. The villa would remain mine, legally and publicly acknowledged as such. The story that I owed them my success would end. The slap would be addressed, not ignored, and apologies would not be whispered in private to be forgotten later. Accountability would be real, visible, and permanent. My father tried to argue once, reflexively, but his voice faltered. He knew the truth. He was no longer in a position to negotiate. They agreed, not eagerly, not gracefully, but genuinely. They had reached the point where denial was more painful than humility. When they left, they thanked me. Not the casual thanks of expectation, but the careful thanks of people who understood how close they had come to losing everything, including me. After the door closed, I didn't feel triumphant. There was no rush, no surge of satisfaction. What I felt was steadiness, the kind that comes when a long imbalance finally corrects itself. That was when I understood the real power of that moment. Revenge wasn't making them suffer. Revenge was standing in front of them without fear, without guilt, and without surrender, and knowing that, no matter what they begged for, I would never again abandon myself to keep their world intact. After they left, the villa felt different. Not quieter it had always been, but lighter, as if a pressure I hadn't realized I was carrying had finally lifted. I stood alone in the living room for a long time, listening to the faint hum of the city beyond the windows. There was no applause, no dramatic closure, no sudden sense of joy. What settled in me instead was something deeper and steadier ownership of my life in a way I had never fully claimed before. For years, I had confused endurance with love. I believed that being a good son meant absorbing discomfort, surrendering boundaries, and offering stability even when it cost me peace. That belief had shaped my choices so quietly that I hadn't noticed how much of myself I had given away. The confrontation, the slap, the silence, and finally the begging had stripped that illusion down to its core. What remained was clarity. I didn't cut my parents out completely after that day, but I changed the terms of our relationship so fundamentally that it could never slip back into its old shape. Conversations became measured, not reactive. Help became intentional, not assumed. For the first time, I understood that compassion doesn't require self-erasure. You can care without surrendering control. You can forgive without forgetting. The villa, once just a symbol of success, transformed into something more meaningful. It became a boundary made of stone and glass, a physical reminder that I had the right to decide who had access to me. Every room carried the quiet proof of independence, no memories of arguments, no echoes of demands, just space. And in that space, I rebuilt myself. I began making decisions without the constant mental echo of parental approval or disappointment. Career choices felt lighter. Relationships became healthier. I noticed how differently I carried myself in conversations, how my voice no longer softened automatically when challenged. Power, I learned, isn't loud, it's calm. It's the ability to say no without explanation and yes without guilt. Looking back, I realized that if I had surrendered the villa that night, I would have lost far more than property. I would have confirmed their belief that force and fear worked. I would have taught myself that my boundaries were negotiable under pressure. By refusing, and by choosing a revenge that relied on dignity rather than destruction, I broke a cycle that had likely existed long before I was born. The greatest shift happened internally. I stopped defining myself through their expectations. I wasn't the ungrateful son, the provider, or the disappointment. I was simply a man who had earned his place, protected it, and learned to value himself without external permission. Sometimes, late at night, I replay that Christmas dinner in my mind, not with anger, but with understanding. I see the younger version of myself sitting there, still hoping to be chosen over money, still believing love would be offered freely if he proved his worth. I don't judge him, I thank him. Without that moment of betrayal, I might have gone on shrinking myself indefinitely. 3 months had turned demand into desperation, control into humility. But the real transformation wasn't theirs, it was mine. I no longer needed revenge to feel strong. The act of choosing myself had already delivered justice. And that is the truth people rarely talk about. The strongest revenge isn't humiliation or loss. It's growth that leaves the other side unable to reach you anymore. It's peace so solid that no slap, no demand, no manipulation can shake it. Standing in that villa, finally whole, I understood that I hadn't just won, I had been freed.